please say hi and introduce yourself. And without further ado, I want to introduce like one of the most exciting guests that I'm chatting with, Gregg. Hi, Gregg.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. I'm very excited. So, for context, for those who don't know, I overlapped with Gregg at Webflow shortly. And hi, good morning, Paul. Thank you for tuning in. And I overlapped with Gregg while we were at Webflow, and we did a lot of collaboration actually. I felt like I was a researcher at that time, and I also feel like I was a researcher now. So that's why I am chatting with him today. And Gregg, why don't you introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure, thank you again for having me on here. It was a pleasure to work with you, and I am so happy that we are still in touch and able to keep in touch through things like this. I'm Gregg Bernstein. I currently lead user research at Condé Nast, which is a family of media publications, including The New Yorker and Vogue, Bon Appetit, Pitchfork, Vanity Fair, Wired, and so on. It's a house of many brands. Prior to that, I led research at Vox Media, which was another house of media brands. Vox included Vox.com and The Verge and Eater, among other brands. Um, I've been researching in media for a while. I think it started when I was at MailChimp prior to Vox Media, where I helped build a research practice and we understood or tried to understand how people were creating content through newsletters and then sharing that content and how people discovered newsletters and specifically how uh, marketers could use newsletters to build a brand, to build awareness, and build loyalty. So that's me. That's who I am, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much, and welcome again on this small time YouTube channel. Um, and I want to ask you, Gregg, what's the draw with publishing house? I'm a fan, by the way. Like I have Bon Appetit magazine just on my nightstand next door, so I'm a fan.
Well, I'm glad to hear you're a fan. For me, the thing about publishing is that the product changes by the week, it seems like. So you have content and content creators. So you have the writers and editors. And if you're working with a number of brands, you have different beats they work in. So, for example, there might be somebody covering technology, somebody covering politics, somebody else covering climate. So you have all these content creators and editors creating various types of content that they're publishing in different formats. So the written word, videos, audio, slideshows, whatever. And then on the other side of it, you have audiences. And again, audiences are wildly diverse. So you have young people who only want to consume TikTok. You have, on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who are only comfortable reading a printed publication. And so you have to understand how do people want to consume content? How do they discover new content? And then the beauty about research in publishing is you're trying to connect these very diverse worlds. So the subject matter is fascinating, the audiences are fascinating, and the work is always different. Every project is different. So I love that it's not, even if it's about podcasting, the person creating the podcast and the people consuming the podcast are going to be different every single project. And so that's what I guess makes it exciting. And that's been the through line for my work from starting at MailChimp to where I am now at Condé Nast. It's just connecting people who create stuff to people who consume stuff and try to figure out how to get them connected somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Do you find doing research that's very content driven? Is it different than like a traditional tech company? I
I
assume
think so.
Mailchimp is still on the tech side a little bit more.
Yeah, MailChimp is definitely on the tech side more, where it wasn't so much about connecting the creator with the audience, but that was still what we ended up doing. With a tech company, it's less about the creation of content. It's about shipping a product or multiple products. And that's a bit different because that is a more, I guess, defined experience. The product does one or two things. It satisfies a couple of jobs to be done, but it's not going to be a wildly diverse experience depending on who is using the product. It's a bit more, I guess, there's more guardrails in place. Whereas with content creation, again, the content itself and the avenues or the medium in which the content is being distributed, it is so wildly diverse, and it can be in multiple places at once. So you might have a podcast that appears in Spotify, but also in Amazon, but also on YouTube, and in a million other places. So it's not the same as working on a product where the experience of that product is more defined.
Yeah, very interesting. Maybe one day I'll work for you at a publishing place. One day.
I would
And
welcome
when
that.
I decide to get into research too. Um, yeah, Greg, so you mentioned this a little bit in your book, which we'll talk about it in in a short while. Yeah. Oh, I can't. Where's my hand? The mirroring is weird. Okay. So, what is your story? How did you decide to get into research?
Yeah, I was a designer coming out of college. A lot of my friends were in bands or they were putting out records. I went to a lot of house shows, so a lot of the bands that I was surrounded by did not have high budgets, so they were trying to create their own T-shirts and their own, I guess, branding. And I really just that was the job I wanted. I wanted to design music packaging. So um, through my network of friends and friends of friends, I built a career as a music packaging designer. I did CDs and LPs and shirts and all sorts of cool things. But after a while, I stopped being as excited about design itself. Or let me back up. I stopped being excited about creating designs myself. I liked talking about design and trying to figure out what are we trying to solve here, what is the big idea we're trying to promote, but I didn't love being the one to open an application and actually make the thing that we talked about. And around that time that I got burned out, I was offered a teaching position at Georgia State University, where I ended up teaching undergraduate design students about basic design principles, about typography, about branding. I really loved being in the classroom. I loved talking about design all day. Um, and I figured this is what I would do for the rest of my life. So I went to get my master's degree in design, um, thinking that that would get me into a tenure track teaching position where I could talk about design all day long. In grad school, in the course of my thesis work, I figured out that what I really loved was not just talking about design, but was user experience and understanding what makes a good user experience. And specifically, what are the things that we need to know in order to create that best user experience, which it turns out was an entire profession called UX research, which was at the time not as I guess well known and not as adopted or common at organizations. This was in 2010 that I was doing my thesis project. So I did my master's thesis. It got a little bit of publicity and it also got some interest from the UX director at MailChimp, Aaron Walter, who said, "Hey, that thesis project you worked on around UX research, how would you like to do that all day, every day at MailChimp?" And I said, I really want to be a professor. And he said, "Hey, universities aren't going anywhere. You could teach later in life, but how about if you come to MailChimp and do this every day, all day now, while this opportunity is here in front of you?" It was a very persuasive argument. And as with most things, he was right. So that's how I got into UX research was through design, through teaching, through grad school, and stumbling backwards unintentionally into a UX research role, which was the best possible thing. I felt like I had found my, I guess, my calling, for lack of a better term, and I just found the right place for me to do my work and do work that makes me happy.
Yeah, that's amazing. So
Totally unintentional and totally lucky.
yeah, I guess like your thesis project you said in the book is about iTunes a user's agreement. So you are the expert on that.
Uh,
So what is
Unfortunately,
that all
yes.
about? I'm just
Yeah,
kidding.
I'm
Tell us
happy to
more
share a little
about
bit
what we
about that.
agreed to.
Yeah, no, nobody knows what they agree to, which is the whole problem. Like when you used to install iTunes, it would ask you to agree to these terms that were 2,500 words and would take up your entire screen. And it just felt very off brand for Apple. it didn't seem like a great experience compared to everything else that comes with Apple. Just, their stores are well designed, their products work really well, their software for the most part is great. And then you have this legal agreement that it was designed by attorneys to satisfy legal requirements. And so my entire thesis was on why couldn't it be better for users while still satisfying the legal requirements that it needs to fulfill. It would still protect Apple from liability, but it would also explain to users what they were getting into when they clicked agree. So that was what I spent a long time researching and proposing new ways to do. So yeah, that was my thesis project.
That's great because clearly I'm one of those people spend 0 second reading what I've agreed to.
Exactly.
A certain episode of South Park come into my mind. Um,
Yes.
yeah. So did Apple take your suggestion?
No, I know that somebody in the company saw it. A connection forwarded my proposal to them, and as with most things, they can't comment and they couldn't say anything publicly. But I know it was circulated within the building.
I'm so disappointed with Apple. So
I know,
Apple, if
shame.
anyone know anyone from Apple, please forward Greg's thesis back to Apple again because after all these years, I still don't know what I agreed to in the terms. Yeah. So
Nobody
that's a
does.
very that's a very long intro so far. And I want to just give us maybe let's change layout a little bit. Ooh, I got bigger. Yeah, I want to give everybody a little bit context why I'm so interested doing this conversation today. So kind of like Greg, I also went to grad school. I did a little bit HCI. Like I also have like an interesting career change. Maybe that's another video. So what for me, because the HCI background, I always feel like research is a big part of what I do. Like after all, like if you don't understand users, how are you designing anything? How are you base any of your like design decisions on? So I always do my research. That's just part of my design workflow. And after working at multiple startups and like bigger company or whatnot, I started hearing very interesting remarks. Like, for example, "Oh, it's so scrappy of you. Thank you so much for doing research." I'm like, okay. And then I got this. I started digging in a little bit more and got this notion of, oh, PMs are now who should be doing research. I'm like, really? And then I started hearing about, oh, designers don't want to do research. And I'm like, really? Then how are you designing? But, anyways, that's why we're talking here today. And that's my observation. So, Greg, am I losing my mind? Who should do research?
Everyone should do research, whether you're a designer or a PM. Everybody should be doing research. The thing is, we often don't bake research into any of our planning. We scope a project, we shape it, we set a roadmap, and then we just expect designers to design. And so the designers find themselves backed into a corner where if they don't do the research, there just won't be research, which guarantees that the whatever you're designing and the end user will be misaligned. Something will not be right. So I do think everybody should be doing research. It's always just the problem is we don't bake it into the process. So let's say you do research. You're still doing something that is not really your job. You were hired to do design, or if you're a PM, you were hired to manage a product. If you're a project manager, you were hired to manage that project. Um, so you're doing a job that it's going above and beyond what you were hired to do, which is why research is always that's why you got that comment that it was scrappy of you to do it because it's not in your job description, or maybe it was like the last bullet point in the job description. You know, must be familiar with usability testing. Um, so it's never baked into the process, which is the problem. Uh, and then let's say you do get buy-in to start baking some research into your process where you say, okay, I'm going to make sure that for any project I do a day of interviews or, before we ship anything, we'll do some usability testing. that's a big victory to get research to inform your work. But then the more you do that, you're still being scrappy. You're still kind of relying on what you might self teach yourself, or you might read from a blog post, or what you pick up from a video with somebody like me, which I'm sorry if this is how you're learning about research. But your organization is leaving a gaping hole where there could be a research expert to make sure that there's good research happening. So who is maintaining best practices across the designers and PMs to make sure that the questions aren't leading users, that the methodologies that you pick are actually the right methodologies to rely on. So yes, everybody should be doing research, but you get to a point where you're still not raising the bar for what does great research look like, and are we doing things the best way? And so you have to ask yourself, how can we make sure that even if we are doing scrappy research, we're doing good quality scrappy research that's going to make sure that we're not building the wrong thing for the wrong people. I know that was a very divergent answer from the very simple question you asked, but that's kind of how I think about it. Like scrappy research is great, but at some point you've got to level up, and you level up by making sure that you get buy-in from higher levels in the organization.
Yeah, there's so many things I want to unpack. Uh, let's do it one. So I
Okay.
think you raise a really interesting point. I never thought about it. And now, now I think about it, it's totally true, which is you never, like when you do roadmap planning, you never really plan in research, especially the more strategic and discovery research.
Hmm.
And designers never do that. Maybe like PMs talk to customers, they're trying to figure out what to build to, like what projects to add into the roadmap. But those are never actually allocated time.
Yeah.
Probably in a lot of startups, especially, you want things done yesterday, so you can't do research. So I
You
think
know,
that was a really good point.
and
But I do think, oh, sorry, I cut you off.
no, no, it's okay. Just to kind of build on that, when I worked at Vox, we worked in 2 week sprints. And so we would have the entire quarter mapped out, and I would see what we were planning to launch in a 2 week sprint. And so I knew what evaluative research I really needed to make sure I scheduled. But then I would say, okay, if we know that we have this project towards the end of the quarter, I'm not going to do any usability testing in this other sprint. I'm going to dedicate that to generative research or discovery research. And so I used the roadmap to kind of carve out space where I'm going to not be working day to day with the team. I'm kind of out ahead of the roadmap to get I guess, the guardrails in place, or the big picture that we need to know about before we start building something. And I think that can work for designers too, where if you see, okay, I know we're building something later this quarter. I'm going to dedicate this week early in the quarter for doing customer interviews, or I'm going to launch a survey if I can, to just get the universe in which I'm building this product and have a better understanding of what I need to do. So there are ways to use the roadmap to get ahead, and again, carve out that time to do research, even if it's not usually baked into your process. You can kind of force your way in there.
Yeah, that's a good add. I think the distinction is kind of important. Like there's generative research, like where you're discovering new problems and new issues. And then there's evaluative research, which I do think is easier for us as
Yeah.
designers to bake in your timeline. So one of the more proud accomplishment I did at Webflow is we actually added in the prototype stage for on the growth team, like first of all. I think that was it was a really proud moment. So before we launch any experiments, we make sure we do either usability testing on a prototype or actually a coded prototype. So there's a lot, like for Webflow, it's highly interactive. Like they should be able to build anything. It's almost impossible for a designer to like copy that in a Figma file or things like that. So we actually have engineers to build throwaway prototypes. They're done in a very hacky way. They don't have to live to the production standard. They live in a separate area on the repo. The main purpose is to help us evaluate the solution
Hmm.
before we let it run for weeks. Um, so yeah, are you proud of me, Greg?
That's a huge victory. I am proud of you.
Yeah, thank you. Um, anyways, so that was like I think something every team can do. Just write in the process, write in the agreement on how we work. We test something before it goes out. Um,
Yes.
and I do want to like just unpack this a little bit more on why it's harder for generative research to be planned in the roadmap. I think one of that is the notion of people think research is slowing things down, things down. So, Greg, how do you feel about that?
I,
How do we
I
change that?
Yeah, I mean, research isn't slowing things down because if you ship something that's wrong, you're going to spend the time you would have spent researching fixing problems, right? You'll either ship something that doesn't work the way users expect. You will fundamentally change something that is a huge blocker to perhaps revenue or usability. People, are famously resistant to change, so you might get feedback that overwhelmed your customer support team. So you're not really slowing things down. You're just shifting around. You're either going to catch things before you launch them, or you're going to stop work to fix the things that you should have caught before you shipped your release. So uh, instead of thinking of it as slowing down the process, it's saying, okay, let's make sure we dedicate some time to de-risking this project before we get too far down the path of no return. Um, because you don't want to have to fix an error that was entirely preventable. So even if it's just one day of talking to your users, or in my case, audience members or consumers, you're going to understand more around the context in which your product or your feature will be used. If you can bake that into the process earlier, you can start saying, oh, but you know what? We spoke to Joan, and Joan told us that, this is how she uses product XYZ. You almost have like a use case in mind. You talk to enough users, you will have a number of different use cases in mind, and you start to have a mental model of where this thing you're building fits into that person's workflow or the course of running their business, whatever it is. Um, like in terms of growth, if you ship the wrong onboarding flow, people might not realize how powerful your product is, right? They might miss all the benefits and the features that would actually make them love your product. So instead of launching a poorly thought out onboarding flow that is designed to build growth, test out that onboarding flow, or better yet, start off the entire project with understanding people's first experiences. Talk to people who just signed up without an onboarding flow to understand what are the features that they discovered, what marketing copy did they respond to, what features did they have no idea about, and then you have a better sense of, okay, our onboarding flow needs to really do a better job of highlighting these different features. So again, I'm going back to my original point. It's not about slowing things down. It's being more thoughtful. It's de-risking the project, and it's saving yourself from unplanned work that you're just going to do after you launch something that doesn't work.
Yeah, so how do we as designers, if our organization is not already on board with this type of thinking? So, like, there's one side which is like, just do it. But then there's also like difficulties added to that. Like, for example, your PMs might not give you enough space to do this type of research, or is
Yeah.
even higher up than your immediate team. It could be your CEO is like, hey, what happens to this like blue button that I said is a good idea yesterday? Why isn't it out yet? How do we started to change the organizational culture a little bit?
I think in this case, your scrappiness is to your advantage. So even though research might not be your job, you might say, okay, I know that we are shipping this in 2 weeks. I'm going to, not secretly, but I'm going to take it upon myself to set up calls with two users and uh, get some feedback and prove that we're getting valuable feedback. And then you can start to go to your PM and your PM's, VP of product and say, we were about to launch this. And after talking to these users, we realized that the button copy didn't make sense, or the placement of this feature made no sense. And we were able to come up with a better design. And so you start using that as evidence that you need to be doing research more often. Or you say to your manager or your PM, let's do an experiment, because all of our designs are basically experiments and we're hoping that they work. Let's do an experiment for this next project. Let's spend one day doing customer discovery. Let's spend an afternoon talking to 4 users. If we learn nothing, okay, great. At least we've heard from our users, and we have some more context around how they work. But you are going to learn something. There's no way after 4 calls or however many calls you won't learn something. So you frame it as, let's just try this and see if we learn something. You're guaranteed to learn something, and then you can say, you know what, we should do this every time. Every time we start a new project, we're going to dedicate one afternoon to customer calls. And you frame these as experiments. The experiments prove useful, and that's how you can start to slowly break down the walls that prevent you from doing research, because you're working together with your PM, you're bringing them into the process, you're making sure they're on the calls with you, hearing all these great insights from your users. They get to hear pain points, they get to ask questions themselves. So they start to see the value of doing this more often. But it's great if you can frame it as, let's just try it out as an experiment. What's the worst that can happen? What do we have to lose? And you'll, again, using that term again, you're de-risking the project, because you're uncovering things that you wouldn't have known in the first place and preventing a bad launch.
Yeah. So taking notes, be scrappy and just do it and try to share the learning. And you always learn something from
Yes.
research.
Yes. And if an organization is telling you, no, don't do any research, and they're blocking that, that's probably not a great sign culturally as a place that is a place for great design. Um, it's rare that I've heard of an organization that is just anti-research. So I would say the experiment tack, of saying, let's just try this, or being scrappy, it should go over well. And if it doesn't, you should probably question where you're working and if you really want to be there.
Yeah, go work for Greg. Um,
Sure,
I
come
hope
on.
you're hiring.
In India, sure. If you are in India, we're always hiring.
Great. Here we go. More value added to Greg. So, and one of the things that, like, I was on a team event last week with Shopify. So, like at Shopify, there are some of the really good designers, like the fabulous designers. And some of the retro topics that came up is a lot of designers don't feel comfortable doing their own research. So, as a researcher, Greg, like you've been a mentor for me on like conducting research. So, how would you suggest for designers who might be just starting to do research? How do we feel more comfortable doing more research on our own?
So when I started teaching way back when, I tried to squeeze so much into every lecture. I had a million talking points. I wanted to cover so much. And one of the other instructors pulled me aside and said, look, the secret to teaching is just have one thing you want your students to learn uh, after every class. You have one goal that you want them to learn, to take in during your lecture. And I think that also applies to research. Yes, we have big, complicated designs. Our products are overly complicated and over-engineered. But when we take on a project as a designer, there's probably one thing we need to know that will help us, I guess, unlock what we're doing with this design. And so my advice for designers who are not familiar or comfortable doing research is really think about, make a list of all the things you want to know about the users of this product, and then stack rank them. If you could only ask one question of a user or an audience member, what is that question? And then if you have time, what's the second thing you want to know? And then if you start to think of it more like a conversation where you have your talking points and you have them listed in order of importance, it makes it demystifies the process because it's not about you don't think of it as research anymore. You're just thinking of it as a conversation with a user, and you have a goal that you want to get out of that conversation. So, what is the one thing you want to take out of a conversation? Even a usability test, it's still fundamentally a conversation where you are showing something to a user, and it doesn't have to be a prototype. It could just be a PDF, and you say, "Hey, look at the screen. What would you expect to do on this page? Or what are all the things you could do on this page? What do you think this button means? What would you expect to happen if you click it?" Think of it as just a series of questions in a conversation where you might or might not be looking at a picture on a screen together. So that's how I think about demystifying research for non researchers. At the heart of it, you're still just trying to get answers to one, two, maybe three questions. More than that, you're asking too much, you have too many goals. And that's when you should think about, okay, how do you break this into multiple projects? What's the thing you need to know to get you started on a design? Work on that. 2 weeks later, you're ready for the next phase. What are the next set of questions you have? Okay, let's call up some users, let's talk to them, let's show them some things. So it's not even about picking a methodology and thinking of it as a research project. It's a series of conversations with your users that are a little bit structured but very casual. That's how I think about getting people started, but if they're not entirely comfortable. But then again, that still goes back to who is the person who is helping coach designers and PMs through this at your organization. That's where having a research lead or research expert can help because even if you only have one researcher and 75 designers, the researcher can at least serve as a sounding board and say, okay, what are all your questions? Let's converge on the two or three most important and turn this into a discussion guide. And I'll walk you through the process of what this looks like when you are talking to users. So I know that's again very divergent answer, but that's how I think about it.
Yes, so much gold in that. Like, for example, narrow down to one thing, one question, be very crystal clear on what question you want to understand, and then having a research mentor helps. Is there any other ways that like can help designers become better at moderating research?
Yeah, I mean, once you've done it, you have to keep doing it. It just takes practice. Um, you know, every researcher and every designer who does research, the first few interviews are terrifying. You are afraid of silences. You don't leave enough time or space for the person you're speaking to to think, to process. You feel like you need to jump in and ask or say more words. So it's one of those things where the more you do it, the more comfortable you get, which again is hard because we don't always have the time to do research. It's not always baked into our process, but the more you do it, the more comfortable it gets. The first few times are never easy. Nobody is comfortable doing an interview the first 5, 10, 15 times. It just takes a lot of practice. You're raising your hand.
I still feel uncomfortable whenever I talk to users. Like,
It's
I
fun.
feel more comfortable maybe talking to the CEO, and then when I'm talking to the users, I was like, "Ooh, I better make this time count. I better not asking a leading question. Oh, shoot, I just asked a leading question."
It's funny though. You hit this point where it goes from terrifying to overconfidence. Like I don't even need to know what we're testing. I could just show up and start saying, "Hey, what would you expect to happen on this screen?" You get so comfortable with not knowing where the interview can go or what direction it's going to go in. It overnight you change from being terrified to I've got this. It's no big deal. I don't even need to prepare. Um, but it takes practice to get there.
Yeah, I am not there yet, certainly not. And there's also another thing. It's kind of like what we talk about in grad school is like when you're in college, you think, oh, I know everything. And the moment you enter grad school, you'll be like, oh, shoot, I don't know anything.
Right.
I think the overconfident piece, there's a little bit um, of that.
You go from
And
imposter to
yeah.
overconfident like overnight, and then switch back and forth occasionally.
Yeah, I definitely see like the more you know, the more humble you will be, I think. Like the more known unknowns that you're mindful of. So like at what point should a researcher take over? Like what type of research should a researcher do? Like at what point should you
Yeah.
advocate for a research leader?
So I think once an organization is, I guess, more bought in on doing research as a fundamental part of the design process, that's where the questions become more complicated and you might have to employ a mix of methodologies. So a usability test isn't going to be enough to know what do we build next. Uh, a survey is not quite enough to know everything you need to know. There's nuance. And so when the questions are more complicated than how will people use this thing that we've already decided to build, and did we build the right thing for the users? I think that's when a research leader can come in and sequence the research so that, okay, we're going to do quarterly surveys. From the surveys, we can segment some different audience or user cohorts so that we can follow up and ask them more in-depth interview questions, and then we'll know who to follow up with and do usability testing. So you're thinking about how to employ different methodologies at different times throughout the quarter or throughout a project cycle, and uh, you're ensuring that the questions you're asking are properly formed. You're making sure the survey questions are going to get you the right cohorts, and they can be segmented properly to get you the right insights for your different audience cohorts. I think when you're bought in on research and you know that there's more you could be doing, that's when you need to bring in a research leader who can make sure that the right methods are being used at the right time to the right audience or users.
Yeah, that make a lot of sense. So in terms of like I assume when you decided to invest in a research organ team in your organization, at some point there's come a problem of how do you share the learnings among multiple people, right?
Yes.
Like I am scrappy, I'm used to doing my research firsthand, so I know what it's like. But the moment I hand my baton to you, I'm freaking out. It's like, where's my empathy? Uh, so, how do you recommend any tips on how to more effectively share these type of learnings and empathy?
Yes. And this kind of goes back to that fluctuation between being an imposter and saying, I got this. Every organization is different. So I often feel like I have no idea what I'm doing when I join a new organization. And that is especially true when it comes to how should research be shared. So at MailChimp, we used Evernote as a source of truth for the entire organization. Every research project was put in Evernote and tagged and organized in a way where people could find it. We had app data being sent over through our API every single night with usage statistics. So Evernote was where research lived. And then in addition to that, we had Friday coffee hours where every month or so somebody from research would get up and talk about things we learned on a recent trip to visit users or things we learned from a survey. At Vox, it was an entirely different scenario. It was a remote first organization where Slack was our source of truth. Everything happened in Slack. So instead of thinking about big reports that lived in Evernote, I thought about bullet points that I could share in Slack in multiple channels. We also used Google Drive. That's where all of our files were shared. So any reports, they lived in two places. I would put them in a research channel in Slack, but I would also have a research, I guess, repository and website that I would put in Google Drive. And now that I'm at Condé Nast, it's very similar where we have our entire organization runs on Google. So I believe in putting research where people are already working. If it's Slack and Google Drive, so be it. If your organization is using Coda or Notion or something else, like if that's where all the work happens, that's where the research should be. I know there's a ton of research, I guess, databases and research insights repositories now on the market. But I've found that the most effective place for research to live is where people are already going. And if you want to share, I shared my screen. Uh, I have found great success in, again, using the tools your organization already has. It's easy to put a Google site together if your organization is using Google products. So this was just taking our Google Drive, putting it into a Google site. I have all of our research here organized by brand and or topic, as well as a bunch of educational materials. This is a place I can point everybody in our organization to. It doesn't matter if they work in my design or product organization. Anybody in the company will be able to find research. If they search in Google Drive, they can find this information. They'll learn something. They'll know it's here. They also know that they can contact me and ask me questions. Um, so again, just to recap, I put everything where people are already working. That's my recipe for sharing research. I I think if you can remove it from silos, if you can break down walls, it makes the research more valuable. It leads to more questions, and it's good for everybody.
Yeah, I'm so interested. Like first of all, this is the most beautiful Google Google Drive repository ever. It's interesting that you believe in putting research where people are, and my fundamental belief is the exact opposite because I think Google Drive is where research insights come to die. Uh, so, like, I'm interested in hearing what's inside these folders. You don't have to show us, of course. Like, how do you make it more searchable? Like, if it's just decks, they will just
Yeah.
be in there. It's very hard for people to get content out of it.
So you'll notice, I don't know if everybody can see it, but it says feel free to browse. But if you're interested in pulling the most relevant information, loop in a user researcher. And it has our Slack channel and it has a link to a request form. So yes, it's cumbersome. You might not find what exactly you're looking for. But within these folders, we have everything broken down by year. So hopefully you'll find the most relevant or recent research. Uh, it's it's topic, year, and then what the project is actually about. That's how this is structured. But ideally, this at least gives you awareness that research is happening, and then you will come to me or my team and say, I'm curious about this thing. And then my team acts as curators and rounds up the research and says, okay, you should look at these three things. And here's links to the files. And let's set up a Zoom so we could talk about it, and I'll walk you through it. So it's not really meant to be just use it and don't talk to us. It's meant to say, use it to think about what questions you have and then ask us a bunch of questions. But I don't want to stop people from at least browsing and seeing what kind of work we do. But it's really designed to provoke a conversation and give us an opportunity to teach people what we already have and what we can still do for them.
Mm,
Oh,
I was mute. That make a lot of sense. It's interesting. So you still have human, like we still have to bother you for
but
like
it's
the
not a
most.
bother.
That's true. That's true. Mindset change. Yeah, and I just had my next startup idea. Where anyone listening, please build a tool that help surface research learning easily. So anything we can do to multiply Greg, it's a win.
Please, nobody wants more of me. No multiple Gregs, please.
Um, so yeah, that's it. I think there's one thing, like kind of selfish of me, that I'm facing a lot is the uncertainty of doing research. So as you level up in like your role, you are like you're expected to have more and more impact in terms of roadmap, what we're building next, where we're going, what's the vision. And to fuel all of that, I believe in you need to do a lot of strategic research, like more generative research. And the broader your area is, the broader your question is. Like, for example, like how can we make people activate on Webflow? Like, what do people do on web? Like, they can be doing a million different things. So
Yep.
these are really broad questions, and then that require you to do these research that's just uncertain. And I find personally a lot of issues when I was trying to propose study like this, because one is kind of, it deserves a proposal because that's like a significant amount of time and resources. And then people are just like, so what happened here? Like, because they're uncertain and you don't exactly know what people will do, like, you want to give your users freedom to do whatever they want to do. Like, for example, a diary study, I would never know how they will use tools like Webflow or Shopify. Um, so, how do you manage these uncertainties from your stakeholder in complex research projects?
Yeah, complex questions are great, but they are a special type of project because you have to set expectations. Um, for example, when I was at Mailchimp, our CEO, he saw that we had a number of companies paying us a whole lot of money, and he was curious, what what are the expectations for Mailchimp among the people who are some of our biggest customers? Do they have different needs than some of our, smaller two-person companies that are using Mailchimp? That was the extent of his question. I mean, from there, we were able to drill down into, you know, what does account access mean? Do they need different levels of permissions across an organization that's using Mailchimp, where there's the administrator, but then there's also the person who they can only view an account? Do they have trouble with sending with spam compliance for newsletters? Similarly, at Vox, our CEO had a question around what would it look like if we switched from advertising revenue to subscriber revenue and asked people to pay us money for content versus giving it to them for free, but they have to look at ads on our sites? These are big questions, and you have to set the expectation that one, um, this isn't a simple project. It's going to take us a while. We are going to have to spend probably an hour or two per interview just to understand what we should even be studying. We need to talk to users just to understand what do we need to know for this project. So there's like pre-research you have to do to shape the research. So you have to frame this project as it's not going to be a simple project. It's big, and we need buy-in to see it through. And then you also have to set the expectation that it's not going to be quick. A strategic research project, I mean, yes, you can do it quickly if you make sure that there's nothing else happening, but it's not something that can be done in a few days. It takes time to find the right people, make sure that your discussion guide is dialed in, really think about what you're hearing and what insights you can take away. So yeah, it takes buy-in. I kind of lost my train of thought, or maybe I've just run out of things to say about it. But it takes buy-in on knowing that it's going to be a big project and that it's going to take time to get those answers. I guess the other thing that I'd say about strategic research is you're not always sure where it's going to go. So you have to be prepared to get answers that you did not expect. You might be taken in a direction that you did not anticipate. You might have had a hypothesis that you hear one set of things, but you hear something entirely different that then you need to dive into and really unpack. Okay, why were our expectations so wrong, and why did we miss the mark, and what is it that we really need to be focusing on? So it just takes a lot of preparation and buy-in upfront.
Yeah, definitely setting expectations, and you do need to get buy-in and set expectations on things could uh, come out differently for these
Um,
type of research.
I forgot to add one more thing in terms of setting the expectations. It's not just about framing what the project might look like and how long it might take. It's going to take budget too. If you're doing strategic research, you're going to be asking people to give you a lot of their time. So you either need to compensate them for their time with a gift card, with some type of payment, with account credits where you give them a month free or 2 months free. But nobody should be expected to give you they shouldn't expect to give you insights for free. You need to pay them for their time, especially if you're asking them to give you more than 20 or 30 minutes. Uh, so budget accordingly for a project like this.
Yeah, definitely compensate users fairly.
Yes.
Yeah, we are. I completely lost track of time, so we're coming up on the hour. So, Greg, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your book? So, for in case you didn't know, Greg is a published author, and tell us more about your book and who should read it.
Yes, thank you for helping me plug my book. Last year, I published this book called Research Practice, and it came about because I would give talks about research or I'd write things about research, and I would often get the same questions. And those questions often fell into the same buckets. How do I get started in UX research? How do I transfer to UX research if I'm from the social sciences? I'm in UX research. How do I level up my career? I've leveled up my career, but now I want to manage. What does that look like? How do I build a team? Okay, I've built a team. This is really hard. Why is it so hard? Okay, I figured out why my job is hard. Now I'm wondering what else I will do with my career. Where do I go next? So all of those were things that I kept getting asked about. And I decided maybe somebody should put this into a book and try to create a guide for user researchers, not just as they are entering the field, but throughout their career so they know what their job as a UX researcher might look like. So I kind of framed the book. I wrote my thoughts on those topics, but I also open sourced it to other members of the research community and invited them to provide their own answers to those questions around how to get in, how to grow, how to deal with the hard parts, and where you might go next after a career in UX research. So it is available now on Amazon, Apple, wherever you buy books. Um, you can learn more about it at researchpractice.co, or you can just stare at this picture of me holding it and bookmark it for later. But yes, it is. It's a book that's out. It's been well received. And yeah, if you check it out, I'd be curious to know what you think. And I'm also happy to talk about the book one on one. So if anybody watching this now or in the future wants to find me on LinkedIn, send me a note, ask me questions. I am a I love being part of the research community. I'm happy to chat with anybody who's interested.
Yeah. So, and I would love to support Greg in any way. Like, Greg has been a great mentor for me. And also, we have Olga in the audience asking, Greg, are you mentoring user researchers?
I just started doing this recently through First Round, which is a VC firm where they paired me with uh, a not junior, but somebody who is starting out their UX research career. This is my trial, my experiment in mentoring officially. If it goes well, then I will keep doing it. But uh, as somebody who also has a team of 5 to soon to be 6 researchers, my capacity for mentoring is pretty limited. So I'm trying this one mentee experience to see how it goes. But I'm always happy to answer questions or at least point people to resources if I can do that in a more casual, less rigid way.
Yeah. And of course, read Greg's book.
Yes,
And
that
Olga,
too.
I'm going to send you a copy of the Kindle version of Greg's book. So please message me after this. And I also want to give anyone who participated in this live channel, live, what is this called? Live stream,
There you go.
uh, a copy of the digital version of Greg's book. Um, Happy to promote the good work, and I really appreciate that you invited some of the like really big name researchers in the industry and share their thoughts. And so like their collection of essays and learnings are really valuable and interesting to me.
Yeah, there's
We
some
have an
fantastic
Yeah.
researchers here. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm just gonna try to speed through because we have a
Yeah.
very specific question in the chat. I'm just looking at it. So, how do you talk to users again and again? Are you suggesting to go back to the same users again or a different user who represent the same persona? How do you
This
do
is a great
continuous user?
question. Yeah, thank you for asking this question. Um, you could do it two ways or multiple ways, but um, when I send a survey to our audiences at Condé Nast or Vox, um, I always ask, are you interested in joining our UX research community, or are you interested in uh, us following up with you if we have further questions? So that's one way to build a panel of participants who you can go to again and again. Again, for compensation, yeah, you don't want to ask people to do stuff for free, but you ask people if they would be willing to be a part of your research community. It doesn't mean you go to the same person every time, but at least you have a list of people who have opted in to sharing their thoughts with you or testing out products with you. So I do think there's value in going back to people, maybe quarterly or annually if they have agreed to be part of a research project. Um, but you also do want to mix it up and get some fresh voices. You don't want to go back to the same people every single time. Um, I know that's harder when you have fewer users in your product, or if you're a startup and you don't have a big list of users. But if you can build up a panel, that's great. But you also want to have some fresh voices at the same time. So I guess my answer is both. Do both.
Yeah, think that's a great answer. And I also want to index on if you only have a small group of people, you're really risking uh over customize, over indexing on
Yeah.
their opinions.
And in that case, there's a few things you could do. Like if you have a customer support team, go through those tickets and see if there's somebody who has an issue with the thing that you're working on, and be proactive and ask if you can follow up with them. If you have a competitor that has products similar to yours, um, you can look and see what people are saying about those products. If it's social media, you might even see people who are tweeting at a company complaining. And then maybe you slide into their DMs and you say, hey, I'm building a product that's very similar to X. Just curious, if I gave you $50, would you be willing to talk to me? So there are ways to get feedback, even if you don't have users for your product, or a lot of users for your product.
Yeah, thank you, Siva. I'm gonna call you Siva because I don't want to butcher your name. Thank you for your question. You'll also get a copy of Greg's book. Please message me after this. And we're coming up on time. Thank you so much for your participation and joining the call. And thank you, Greg. Always enjoy talking to you. And whenever I talk to you, I go over time. So absolute pleasure talking to you today, and I hope we continue keep in touch. And if you enjoy this conversation, please like this video so me and Greg knows we helped some people in at some point of their career. So yeah, without further ado, and I'm gonna let everybody go.